philosophy. Yet the text as story tradition in play here has also been regularly displaced in recent academic film and television studies. In the history of religion, however, story texts are very much matter, on their own, something to mine as charged cryptic codes for keys to life, God, and existence, a project that takes considerable effort and care. I also think it no accident that all three of these series can be seen as auteurist or signature shows as well, since in a theological sense, authorship cannot be easily separated from the authority of the one telling the story. These papers grapple with the authority of the maker to understand the messages encrypted in HBO's holy texts. All three shows show that the critic's game is about interpretation of the allegory and not about the messenger delivering the allegory. After reading these papers, I realized that they might be usefully placed within three broad subfields: ethics, eschatology, and ontology, respectively. Craig's paper on the wire made the ethical questions of lived religion and the prophetic mode chief concerns. His analysis wasn't just about the social histories of Baltimore. It was also a study of moral standards and how they affect conduct, both on and off the screen. Craig's paper churned up the fundamental question, how shall we then live? Horace's paper on Deadwood clearly fits instead within an eschatological tradition, as he himself suggests, since it repeatedly implicates religious doctrines concerning the human soul and its relationship to death, judgment, heaven, and hell. It's hard to imagine using Swearingen's behavior as a moral compass or ethical roadmap for anything in real life. By positioning the series as an ubermyth and a Genesis allegory, both for humanity and for the nation, Horace's analysis circled around the question, where do we come from? Adele's paper on The Sopranos was less concerned with either the moral or ethical dimension of the Sopranos story world, as in Craig's account, or with connections between the story world and explicit theological ideas intended by the series author-producer, as in Horace's analysis. Instead, it was about the existential predicament and ontological questioning by characters within the fiction. Taking a cue from Tony, Adele underscored the primary ontological question, who am I and where am I going? But didn't offer these answers to those questions like Horace's showrunner, Milch. In my mind, the three papers, not just the series story worlds, also represent a continuum between grounding on the one side and transcendence on the other. Craig's paper opened with a very personal disclosure and situated the wire in both his life and in the specific material and social histories of Charlotte, North Carolina, and Baltimore. Horace navigated many of the existential concerns of Adele, but returned to the public person of Milch to crack open the complex code of Deadwood's story world. Adele provided a nuanced reflection on how the dark world of Tony Soprano churned up fundamental philosophical questions about fate, determinism, free will, good versus evil, etc., but resolved them at the very end by placing them in the context of the very open-ended and transcendent view of French poet Prévert. Unlike Horace's fate-driven Deadwood characters, which grind their way to their dismal allegorical ends, Adele's Tony at least gets to have epiphanies and self-consciousness and a therapist, even if he will inevitably get whacked. All three papers dealt with visceral, violent, bodily, dark, and very fallen worlds. All three series deploy fatalism with key metaphors. The piano constantly hanging over Tony's head that Adele cites in The Sopranos, and Valchek's van lost forever at sea like a rock around the neck and dragging him down in Craig's longer paper about The Wire, are metaphors that just as easily apply to Horace's Deadwood inhabitants. None of these papers offer solutions, all raise questions and underscore at some point in their pages a common theme, the almost mystical connectedness of all humanity. These papers in these series also raise a number of complementary questions that weren't asked but might be. Why do we as scholars and critics go to elite, higher culture, premium channels like HBO that fewer people watch to find and locate God, rather than to low culture religious broadcasting talk shows where God ostensibly addresses and speaks directly to viewers in second person? Aren't the character hosts on religious TV, after all, more like the prophets than, as Craig shows, David Simon is on The Wire? After all, they speak directly to viewers about the meaning of life, the consequences of sin, the viewer's sin, not Swearingen sin, and the end times. Why are we, as scholars, so invested in HBO but not TBN? What is the logic of having to work so hard to decrypt and unpack the complex messages of The Wire, Sopranos, and Deadwood? Because does God take this much work and critical discipline? And of course, schooling? For someone to see that a rape or a decapitation is not a rape or a decapitation, but rather an important form of moral guidance or spiritual reflection. What would happen if instead of looking at Simon Milch and the other signature showrunners as the authors, we looked at HBO as the parable teller? What does having a messenger like this, who enlightens and connects us with grace and humanity's oneness, say about ourselves? One comment in particular tweaked my curiosity about these alternative possibilities. Craig makes a very convincing point that The Wire makes a, quote, blistering critique of unchecked capitalism, unquote. I agree. But does this mean that the HBO Time Warner conglomerate is making a blistering critique of its own out-of-control capitalism, which is arguably the very definition of corporate media conglomeration? How, therefore, can this type of on-screen critique, arguably in the other series as well, have any teeth? Could the same kind of contradiction undercut not just the political bite, but also the metaphysical preoccupations of HBO's prestige programming as well? This question made me consider how HBO's prestige programming may be analogous to the Shakespeare industry. After all, this literary industry never seems to die. Folks with vested interest each generation, including English departments and the middle culture capitalists in Hollywood, constantly prop it up as high culture, and it ignores or erases the bard's low culture origins in the 17th century and his mixed cultural manifestations in the 19th century. Like the Shakespeare industry, should we talk about the premium cable cultural industry, which constantly pushes certain kinds of narrative experience up the cultural caste system to higher and more exclusive cultural niches, where a certain kind of engaged reflection and distinctive media consumption can simultaneously and profitably occur? And some final thoughts. One trait shared by all three papers was the sense that we get to watch these series, their stories and their characters, from an Olympian point of view. Numerous references are made in the longer papers to Greek tragedies, not just to Shakespeare. These are ugly, fallen worlds, but arguably not the worlds of the affluent that pay for and consume HBO. It dawned on me that perhaps this very staged cultural elevation and constructed elitism is exactly why these three series, and others like them, work so well on HBO. All positioned, to use a shop-worn term, the spectator in a place of omniscience and omnipresence, scanning down from the mountaintop to observe, judge, and pity the poor tragic mortals and the sprawling epics and multiple plot lines below. The terms are different, but now we may pay the tithes, alms, and indulgences not to get into the temple to worship, but to clear the decks in our harried, affluent lives, to view serious, explicit, boundary-pushing morality plays on our widescreen TVs and home theaters. I would never go as far to say that watching premium cable or their DVDs is a religious experience, but doing so clearly bears affinities with the rituals, conventions, and focused personal reflections long associated with lived and organized religion. In the complementary scheme that I am considering here, with HBO as God's messenger, one would, of course, not expect God to be explicitly represented or embodied among the poor, tragic denizens of Deadwood or east of Baltimore. This is because we, as HBO viewers, have been given the deity's vantage point in the narrative text as part of our purchase. And this vantage point is not cluttered up by constant commercial breaks, promos, and interstitials, the ugly contemporary flack that corresponds to the visceral, fallen worlds on screen, including the mud and blood-splattered clothing of the Deadwood folk. HBO, it's not television, it's God thinking. Now there's a